You may have noticed that there's a lot of Harry Potter analysis content trending all over the place recently, or at least there is on my feeds, as per the wishes of the benevolent algorithm lords. And of course, this makes a lot of sense. Hogwarts Legacy is set to release soon, or has already dropped depending on when you're seeing this. And of course, the controversy surrounding the author's trash socio-political takes generates a huge amount of engagement. In addition, if instead of being mad at me for not centering this discussion around J.K. Rowling's psychotic transphobe whining, you're instead a quote-unquote apolitical gamer who's mad at me for implying which side of this fight I'm clearly aligned with, I urge you to maybe gather yourself, stop complaining about how triggered you might be because some rando on the internet had the gall to briefly touch on some relevant context, and try to understand that this video might not actually be what your initial gut reaction is telling you it is. Because the fact that this trilogy of Harry Potter games is part of the Harry Potter franchise is surprisingly completely incidental to the crux of what I'm going to dive into. In fact, these first three games could be attached to a completely different IP, and there really isn't much I'd have to change about the script for better or worse. That's because my point, or my thesis, if you will, is that these first three Harry Potter games, for PC specifically, are the missing link between Banjo-Kazooie and LEGO Star Wars. These are the collectathons, or whatever new term people have come up with now, that bridge the mechanical gap from the 90s platformer adventure games beloved by an older generation, all the way to a more modern style now beloved by younger generations. And while I might be comparing and making judgments on the design choices made as this trilogy evolved, it's not going to be as much a criticism on what was lost or gained between these eras. Rather, what I think is interesting is the effect that the rapid explosion of gaming technology had on the still not fully formed genre. Unlike the current state of gaming, where hardware improvements are at best sadly incremental, this era of the 2000s was seeing every year take a radical leap forward in what devs were capable of producing. An obvious example of this, within the Harry Potter games we're going to be talking about, is the sheer scale of the Hogwarts interior, which seems to about double every sequel. Which is also kinda cool as a lore nerd, considering it's a much better representation of the ever-shifting nature of the Hogwarts layout than any of the movies or even really the books ever show us. Supposedly the castle is, like many of the other existential horrors of the wizarding world, alive and constantly transforming as it takes new forms, both to accommodate the needs of its inhabitants and to intentionally hide the many objects hidden within its walls. It's an integral part of the power fantasy that this franchise was designed to fulfill, a home away from home that never quite loses its mystery. There's always new secrets to stumble across. But, ironically, none of the primary media sources ever quite satisfy that promise, with the movie adaptation of Harry Potter the Prisoner of Azkaban being the only major transformation of the school, and even then, primarily in terms of the grounds surrounding the castle. So, it's funny to me that the pure coincidence of when these games were developed led to the video games more accurately representing a concept that was probably not even a consideration to its creators. All the same, we've probably spent enough time discussing the context of these games as they relate to the movies and books, so let's push onward to their place within video game history instead. A lot of you might have been looking at this footage and thinking, I've seen enough memes to know this ain't my Harry Potter video game. Where's the funny faces? That's not PS1 Hagrid. Have you lured me into some kind of nightmarish Rubik's Cube alternate hell? No, actually. Unlike what you're used to today, where a company will simply port the same game to multiple systems, it was relatively common to create many different games to supply to many different systems, in some cases with alternative developers. In this case specifically, the first Harry Potter game has a total of 6 different developers listed on its Wikipedia page, with only Westlake Interactive exclusively working on a port, meaning that there are a total of 5 different Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone games floating around, spread out across a variety of systems. A big part of why I wanted to make this video is actually because of the split. That, and the evil influence of personal nostalgia making me irrationally angry that not everyone grew up with the exact media that I did. There's actually a ton of content floating around about the console releases, which obviously makes a lot of sense, considering the PlayStation 1 release is one of the best-selling games on the system, as pointed out here in Wikipedia. Which kinda means, in a roundabout way at least, this is actually some fresh content. You've all seen the meme game, but there's very few vids exclusively on the version I grew up with. Because while the first PlayStation game shares some similarities with the PC version, the console games quickly veer off into more action-oriented territory with every sequel, while the PC releases instead double down on the collectathon, secret hunting, Metroidvania-like gameplay that many gamers would eventually come to love the LEGO games for. Note that the first LEGO Star Wars would not come out for another 4 years in 2005, and while there were cool LEGO games coming out like Island Racer and the Bionicle series, these were all nothing like the licensed games that would come later. Which isn't to say that they weren't making licensed games. In fact, LEGO had produced 2 LEGO Harry Potter games under the Creator series right around this time, and part of my theory is that this might have gotten the company to take a closer look at what other developers were doing with the Harry Potter license, and formed perhaps the initial inspiration for Telltale's licensed LEGO games. But before we get into the 2004 release of Prisoner of Azkaban, which most closely resembles what LEGO games would become, replete with an entire system based around different characters having unique abilities which unlock specific secrets and levels. We should instead start with where it all began, because while Philosopher's Stone might be the most basic of the 3 in terms of gameplay, its level design, even just purely from an aesthetic standpoint, is a great example of creativity emerging from technological constraints. And in a way, I'd argue the series, which seems to get uglier with each graphical upgrade, is almost a perfect mirror of the complaints a lot of gamers now have with the emphasis companies put on realism over artistic choices. So what's this game even like anyway? What do you do? I'm not gonna rehash the plot because you've probably already heard it a million times, though for the most part your main goal is not going through the school and defeating Tommy the Riddler, but instead stealing every single thing that isn't nailed down so eventually your collection will be complete, and you can pretend to impress your friends. Specifically in this entry, the 2 major objects of power are, firstly, Bertie Bott's Every Flavored Beans, or Wizard Money according to Child Me, and secondly, Witch and Wizard trading cards, which progressively become the most important thing in the series. Collect enough beans and you get a secret ending, with the Weasley twins popping up at random places like surprise middle managers making sure you're meeting your quotas.
Hey Harry, do you have 25 beans for us? We need the beans for some experiments. Nice work, Harry. You found all the beans we needed for now. Here's a wizard card then. Hope you don't have this one yet. Thanks for helping us out, Harry.
Collect all the trading cards and you unlock the last special one, which doesn't seem like much until you realize it's the exact same as the achievement/trophy that requires you getting all the other ones first. So it's actually mechanically ahead of its time. In order to do this, you must jump, climb, cast, and oof your way through a series of levels loosely based on the original story while obsessively clicking on every single patch of pixels just in case there's a secret door or switch. If you have OCD, you'll probably find everything. If you're the opposite, then you'll probably miss more than you'd expect. Either way, this first entry is especially easy, not just because it's geared towards kids, but because the formula of what makes these games tick is still in its infancy. Remember, this is 4 years before LEGO Star Wars, so the only games the devs have to work off of are Banjo-Kazooie and maybe Spyro, and even then, those and other games you might be thinking of are not quite close enough to make a direct comparison. If you're considering playing this game for the first time as an adult or replaying it out of childhood nostalgia, I think the gameplay might be too simple and easy at this point to maintain your interest. To the point where I almost recommend you pair a playthrough of this game with your substance of choice, because not only will it actually make a lot of the platforming potentially as challenging as it would be for a kid back in 2001, also because one of the most memorable aspects of this first entry when compared to the later sequels is its incredibly trippy level design. Philosopher's Stone the game came out right in that sweet spot where 3D graphics were just getting good enough to actually look like the objects they were trying to represent, while still being early enough to force the devs into taking a lot of liberties with their layouts. We're not just talking weird rooms whose general purpose will forever elude me, but also stuff like bottomless pits with weird roiling fog, labyrinthine water systems, baked-in lighting that gives rooms weird psychedelic color schemes even after their source is removed, and structure suspended within black voids deep within the bowels of the castle. It reminds me of my favorite page from the webcomic prequel adventure. Set within our protagonist's nightmare, the character encounters a long staircase suspended within a similar dark abyss. As you scroll down the page, she descends, matched in pace by a writhing, shadowy mass that both bursts out beyond the confines of the panel, while at the same time seemingly made out of the same material as the comic itself. I think it's very powerful imagery that almost opposes the idea that the entities within a work are distinct from the form factor of the art itself. While Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone never quite reaches that height, it feels like it's moving in that direction. That with a more intentional push, it could have really captured the horror that's always lying within the subtext of the Harry Potter universe. Because, as an avid sci-fi fan who usually finds a lot of fantasy and feudal era visual design to be uninteresting, this sort of stuff really sparks my imagination. It's almost a dark twist on the space folding magic we see with the tents and bags of holding used throughout the series. This idea of layers upon layers of reality buried in non-Euclidean geometry containing who knows what kinds of entities. Things that get lost, beings that were sealed away, and perhaps alien intelligences born and evolved to survive in spaces that don't mimic the natural laws of our reality that all other creatures trust in intuitively. I think it lends to an atmosphere that's much creepier than even The Prisoner of Azkaban, which is supposed to be the scary one, because the threat is so much more ambiguous, conceptual, and ultimately never directly encountered. Like, sure, these spell obstacle courses are probably well vetted by the teachers because they have to set them up. But what about the many secret rooms and passages, the ever-shifting interiors that may lead to locations previously sealed away for perhaps hundreds of years? At one point, you find a fellow student wandering within one of these spell challenge levels, and I think it's supposed to be just a little Easter eggy jokey thing. But at the same time, it set my child brain racing. What if they never found their way out? What if this was some kind of shapeshifter attempting to lure me into helping? What if this student had been trapped here for decades with some magical attribute of the place keeping them young forever? The idea of this lurking horror spilling out from the seams of this ancient structure are laughable to me now as an adult, because the boundaries of a game like this are so much more obvious. But I don't think that means this element of the game should be discounted, because it is made with kids as the target demographic. It's actually really interesting to me that the Philosopher's Stone is capable of supplementing its relatively simple game design with implications that tap into the overactive imagination of its audience. Whether intentional or not, it's incredibly artistically creative. And it's really a shame that the rest of the series runs away from this, almost as if the devs were scared of parents getting mad at how spooky it was, and I think you can see something similar happen within the context of the movies too. Sure, the content of the plot gets technically more horrific as you're introduced to more dark magic or whatever, but the dreadful mystery of the Wizarding World's secrets slowly gives way to whimsy, as the narrative focuses its horror on the antagonists and retools Hogwarts and other magical locations into nostalgic refuges safe from that horror. It's especially unfortunate because other than this fascinating touch of horror and the creative visual design, there's really nothing else to say about the Philosopher's Stone that isn't objectively done better in the sequels. So in an effort to move on to that, let's talk about one of the biggest upgrades going from 1 to 2, so we can transition to the next game up to bat, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Similar to what you might find in a licensed LEGO game, all of these Harry Potter entries have a sort of hub through which each of its various levels are accessed. Obviously, it's only natural to portray the actual location of Hogwarts this way. Even if it hadn't previously been a staple of the genre, the games probably would have included the feature anyway. But because the scope of Philosopher's Stone was very limited, this hub ends up feeling fairly small and empty, to the point where they repopulate a lot of chests and some secrets between each normal level, making this less like a traditional hub and more like transition areas that all reuse the same layout. However, this all changes, starting with Chamber of Secrets, as the sheer scale of Hogwarts is expanded enough to create a true hub experience, where it begins to rival the complexity of the spell challenge sections, which in the previous entry contained the bulk of the gameplay. Right from the start, secrets and puzzles are obviously visible just walking through the grounds and corridors, with the twist being that they all require spells only able to be acquired later in the game. Thus, the repopulating areas of interest are mostly dropped. When you complete one of these secrets, there's almost no reason to return unless for some reason you need like 3 beans you can get from the few things that do respawn. This gives you very concrete goals. You see a ledge that's clearly got a trading card you want, and then it's up to you to earn the abilities necessary to achieve it. And sometimes you'll gain the magic needed to unblock the first obstacle, only to discover a second half to the secret, requiring a different spell entirely. Which I think could possibly annoy some people, but in my opinion, gives these areas much more memorable progression. Unfortunately, this Metroidvania element does not apply to the rest of the levels, which, in my opinion, is what truly allowed the later LEGO series to achieve the success that these Harry Potter games never could. The average level from the first LEGO Star Wars game might be less complex on your initial run-through than any of the zones found within the Chamber of Secrets. But it's the subsequent replays of chapters, utilizing the myriad of character unlocks, that really makes those games shine. Because while Chamber of Secrets does finally introduce the ability to retry its spell challenge sections, it's all based around the newly introduced score system. This is a feature where the faster you progress and the more challenge stars you discover, the higher your score is, and the higher your score is, the more house points you ultimately earn. Unfortunately, therein lies the problem, because, well, the reward for beating out the other houses is very desirable. It's not all that difficult to obtain, both because it's decently easy to reach a very high score your first run, even if you take the time to obsessively search for secrets, and furthermore, there are also many mini-games which supplement your house points drastically as well. The most apparent but awful of which is found right before every spell challenge. The most apparent but also awful of which is found right before every spell challenge in the game, when Harry must first actually learn to cast the spell. Which I gotta say is weirdly fast. Like, I know they could only include so much content, but god, does this trivialize the process. Like, how much cooler would it be if you had to go through multiple classes to learn a spell, each time upgrading your cast from a pathetic variation all the way to its true form? This way, there'd be even more progression through secrets, as, for example, Spongify, which is a spell that creates bounce pads, might give you a different height depending on your spell proficiency. And perhaps the final form would allow you to control the direction each pad would launch you. Thus, you attach multiple secrets to one single pad instead of having this mess they end up using in the actual game. In fact, you could have a cast system similar to the way Expecto Patronum works in the third game, with how long you hold down the spell and the visual indicator of the magical energy creeping up Harry's arm, allowing you to decide the version of the spell you wanted to use even after unlocking them all. Instead, what we get is this nasty, gross rhythm game that I despise with all of my heart. You see, in Philosopher's Stone, there was a spell minigame as well, but in this one you had to trace the shape of a sigil that signified each different form of magic with a decreasing time limit. And while this minigame could be very frustrating, it was at least representative of what students actually would be practicing. But in Chamber of Secrets, I feel like I'm just playing a bootlegged copy of Elite Beat Agents that's only as hard as your ability to not get distracted by something more interesting. Like, as a guy who struggles to complete any song in Guitar Hero even on the easiest difficulty, I still 100%ed every single one of these spells on my first try. It's so bad, in fact, that Prisoner of Azkaban scraps the entire concept of learning spells altogether, which is really disappointing, but I guess is still better than this garbage returning. Luckily, this is not the only minigame. But unluckily, this entire franchise seems to just not understand what a good minigame even is. Quidditch has been changed from a discrete level, like in the previous game, to an optional house points booster. It's pretty pathetic, as the only controls are wiggling your mouse around and spamming left click, cause all these matches are on rails, you have no control over your actual flight. I'd mention that you have to dodge obstacles, but considering you can pretty much buy the Quidditch armor the second you unlock the minigame, it's actually okay to just run into everything. Plus, to continue the pattern set by spell alerting, it's once again worse than what Philosopher's Stone already had. And do you know what that was? Flying through rings with janky controls. Yes, they somehow made a minigame worse than Superman 64. It's baffling. At last, with the third minigame, we actually have something that's worth your time. Dueling. And while I've played much better versions of this formula, it's not bad for a 2002 game intended for kids. In this, you have access to 3 spells. A red one that just does damage, a blue one that makes the target fizzle their next cast, and a yellow one that reflects a spell while increasing its power. The red and blue can be charged for extra effect, and the reflect will always work no matter how powerful the magic you're trying to parry is, resulting in these fun little ping-pong duels. It could be better, like, for example, how the blue stun spell is pretty useless, and is basically just there to make it impossible to instantly switch from your red damage magic straight into your reflect for easy wins. But ultimately, it's a fun addition, and the inclusion of changing arena obstacles as you climb the ranks gives it that variety that the enemy AI can't. If I'm being honest, I don't think any of the Harry Potter games across any of the systems has ever had good combat, but this at least comes closer than most of my other experiences with the franchise. I mean, I could go on a whole rant about how boring fights are in Harry Potter, considering most boil down to people shooting different colored lights at each other, instead of any interesting environmental battles, which we only briefly see at the end of Order of the Phoenix. But I'll spare you that, because we're focused here on collectathon games, where combat should at most be a puzzle anyway. This is why I think the addition of fire crabs is really all the game needed to do. Touching on Philosopher's Stone again briefly, there were these snails that damaged you through physical contact or via their slimy trails. Rather than just being enemies, they would also serve as surrogate blocks you could knock onto pressure plates to activate certain mechanisms throughout a level. Fire crabs are like the upgraded version of this. They provide the same utility, but are able to damage you from a distance. Meaning that if you were using one for a puzzle, you'd have to keep an eye on the rest to make sure they don't flip over and hit you from behind, adding a bit of needed tension to certain areas. And it's these elements and what the devs would ultimately do with them that allow these games to start truly feeling like the foundations for what LEGO games would eventually become. For example, at the end of your first spell challenge, there's this long circular ramp. At the top is the star needed to end the level, but it's just out of your reach. At the bottom is a pit with a fire crab emblem clearly labeled on its floor. The puzzle is one you've already done many times up until this point, so it's intuitive to simply knock the various crabs littered across the incline down into this hole, and then end the challenge, as the star is clearly lowered with every crab pushed. But if you look down towards the hole after tossing them all in, you'll notice that the pit is also lowered, and an odd wall is now revealed by its height. To me, this feels very LEGO. I could absolutely see a puzzle just like this in one of those early entries. And it's this kind of stuff that starts heading down the route that I wish the series had continued on. Because, well, it's still not quite as complex as I'd like. The layers Chamber of Secrets adds onto puzzles that in Philosopher's Stone were basically just, hey, this wall looks different, I guess it's a secret room, is exactly what's needed. I think because of the lack of switchable characters in this particular entry, there's only so much that can be done, but when compared with what came before, it feels like a whole new dimension has been unlocked with the steps Chamber of Secrets adds to its secrets. Instead of gargoyles simply illuminating a single thing which a cutscene then immediately points the camera at, you're always left wondering what else might be lurking around. That maybe if you could just do this platforming section a little faster, you could get to the other end before your light extinguishes and maybe open a passage 3 rooms past where you were supposed to use it. And thankfully, the devs absolutely reward you for trying to test this game's boundaries like that. Chamber of Secrets is designed around completing an intended puzzle that presents an obvious line of progression, then stopping and thinking to yourself, maybe I can use the same thing for something else entirely. It's setting the initial building blocks for something that doesn't just test you mechanically, but conceptually too. And while I think that most of these tests would still only challenge a kid at best, and at worst are so obtuse even an adult would still need to look up a guide, it's solidifying a formula for what could be an incredibly creative and complex sequel. But unfortunately, that's not really what we ended up getting. See, as a kid, I always thought Prisoner of Azkaban was the coolest. It's the biggest, it's got tons of new features, it's way faster, and the spells you learn are much more mechanically interesting. I mean, you get a spell that lets you play as a rabbit and a dragon. It's hard for that to not make a kid at the time super hyped. And look at how many beans there are. Look at all the beans. Finally, I'm the real human being. But as an adult, I realize a lot of it is fluff. There's barely any secrets in the game compared to the last entry, with most things to collect just coming from blasting random objects or opening up shallow rooms containing just a chest sitting there, wondering why you even bothered. The minigames are back, and even worse, it's just bad, tedious, shallow combat most of the time. Or if you'd rather, you can play Flappy Bird, but 3D. Oh, but wait, you say, what about how much bigger Hogwarts is now? It's got all 7 floors, finally. And sure, except they're all at best 5 rooms big, and at worst, just a single room with one thing to do in it. In fact, this whole game feels very rushed, since it's so much shorter than Chamber of Secrets, and I have to wonder why, considering it had much more development time. Oh hey, remember how I said this game finally introduces characters with unique abilities that allow them to access parts of the game that others can't? Well, that's only relevant near the end, and even then, only within predetermined levels. That's right, nothing in the Hogwarts hub allows you to use any of the spells you learn throughout this game. Every secret is accessed with magic from the previous game that you immediately start with here. The only reason you can't clear the whole hub right away is because of the new Okami system, which is actually one of the few interesting aspects of the game. Now there aren't just beans, but also pumpkin pasties and cauldron cakes, which each can be exchanged around for cards and other resources like passwords that open up new rooms. But that also means stuff you normally have to discover for yourself is now just paywalled with an instant payoff when you drop the cash on it. Even the Bean bonus room suffers from this new attitude surrounding the cost of entry being all you need to earn rewards. You see, the Bean bonus room was a beloved feature introduced first in Chamber of Secrets. It's that desirable reward for having the most house points that I mentioned earlier. Essentially, it was this extra challenge area filled with goodies for you to collect, the only threat being the timer constantly ticking down, and when it reached 0, you were instantly booted out. This was maybe Chamber of Secrets gameplay at its strongest, because it's filled with areas you can see, but only access with magic not available until you progress through the game. Meaning, not only would you have to start off tactically considering which path to take under the strict time limit, so you didn't lose valuable time running into an obstacle you didn't have the proper spell to defeat. But it also meant that every time you returned at a later point in the game, more and more of this bonus area would open up to you, and the reward would exponentially increase without the devs needing to design an entirely new level each time. Prisoner of Azkaban has a bean bonus room too, and on first glance it's the same, if not better, because of the sheer increase in assets the game was able to have in a zone at the same time, utilizing the improvements in PC technology. But once again, like the hub, everything here is accessible with spells you already learned in Chamber of Secrets. There's nothing to unlock, nothing new to do on subsequent runs. And eventually the room just starts throwing collectibles at you. The strategy of an efficient path is nearly completely lost. So while I think Goblet of Fire, the 4th game, is where this series truly died, the cracks are clearly showing already. And of course, a year later, LEGO Star Wars releases, and blows Prisoner of Azkaban out of the water in every way possible. Sure, Harry Potter tried to swing back by rushing out Goblet of Fire, the game I just mentioned, which clearly apes off of LEGO Star Wars with its camera angle and level design. But it ends up such a horrible mess that I never want to talk about it again for the rest of my life. Like, I was planning to include that game within this video, but it just makes me so violently ill that I have to grab this footage from trailers and stuff, because if playing that game was necessary to complete this video, I just would never finish it. And besides, well, there is a lot I like about Prisoner of Azkaban. The gap left in the market that LEGO Star Wars perfectly filled, and its many licensed sequels ended up completely molding in their image, is apparent even starting here with the third game. There's an alternate timeline out there where this Harry Potter series hit those perfect notes long before the LEGO games, where maybe LEGO Star Wars was even more betterer because they had stronger foundations to work off of, and competition forcing them to fight tooth and nail for sales as debates raged between which take on the genre was superior. But instead, Harry Potter ended up leaving the goal wide open and allowing LEGO to essentially roll in and monopolize the entire genre. Which, well, not bad at first, probably caused a lot of the samey sequels people complain about a decade later. That's only really a footnote, though, a speculation on things that were not and now never can be. Because I hope what was clear here is not a judgment of what's better or worse, but instead the interesting struggle for a lesser-known developer to forge a genre that at the time basically did not exist. These mistakes they were making, from our future point of view, are ridiculous and obviously bad. But to a group of artists who at the time had nothing to build off of and nothing to build against as a rival series, this is just the necessary experimentation that has to be done in order to figure out what even works. And with a budget loads worse than their LEGO counterparts, and with a team I also assume to be much smaller, it's spectacular that they succeeded as much as they did. It's an underdog story, and while they may have lost in the end, they still created something completely ahead of its time and unique to what anyone else was trying to do. There's a lot of games that share elements with what LEGO games would become that have collectibles and platforming and all the rest. But none of them come quite as close as these PC Harry Potter games did. And I think that's worth remembering at least as much as some funny PS1 faces.